Hey science fans, I'm going to carry on doing DNA and I'm going to be talking about inheritance. Now this is for everyone, triple trilogy. We're going to talk about the key diseases you need to know, how characteristics are inherited and how things pass from one generation to the other. Let's get cracking. Worth noting that quite often I see in exam papers, they inherited this from their mum. Or I hear, yeah, but I look more like my dad, so I inherited more DNA from my dad, or I inherited more genes from my mum, etc., etc. Not true. You inherit exactly 50% of your DNA from your mum and exactly 50% of your DNA from your dad. Half each. It just depends on whether those characteristics are dominant, recessive, how they combine together, but you do not have more of one parent's DNA than another. It is exactly 50-50. Unless something really weird's happened. Just a little bit of a reminder, remember DNA is this double helix polymer of repeating units. Okay, when we inherit characteristics, we are inheriting portions of this DNA in genes, and genes code for proteins which inherit, oh I got a message, which can code for characteristics. Okay, and our characteristics can be produced in two ways. They can either be inherited or they can be environmental. And you need to know which of these certain characteristics are. So inherited characteristics are generally things that come in your DNA, your genetic code that you cannot change. So for example, your blood type, you can't change that. Eye colour, you can't change that unless you just stick on a contact lens and you're just concealing it, you're not changing it. Your initial hair colour, your height potential, your actual height might be environmental. Environmental characteristics are things that are governed by your environment. So things like your accent, you don't get born with a certain accent, you pick that up based on the environment. Your hair colour, you may dye that, but your initial hair colour is going to be inherited. Whether you have a tattoo or not. Your weight, your height can also be environmental depending on how much food you have. Let's talk about how we inherit characteristics. Now, we know that you and everyone came into being because at one time a sperm, there's the nucleus, there's the acrosome full of the enzyme, an egg, this is completely out of proportion. The egg would actually be enormous in comparison, but here we be. So this would be carrying 23 singular chromosomes. This would be carrying 23 singular chromosomes. So we would call these haploid cells because they contain half of the genetic information in them. So half the amount of chromosomes, half of the DNA in a sperm and in an egg. So these are called gametes. And they are haploid cells because they have half the number of cells. During fertilization, the nuclei fuse. And when that nuclei fuses, we now have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay, this is now a diploid cell because it's got double the amount of chromosome and it's called a zygote. And that happens at fertilization. Then what happens is we get mitosis. Separate video on that, I think. You get mitosis happens, and then that develops into a fetus, which kind of look like mini dragony things initially, and then that will develop into the apple of someone's eye. That's petrifying. Anyway, this baby will have inherited 23 chromosomes from mum and 23 chromosomes from dad, and each pair of chromosomes. So there's 23 pairs made up of wound up DNA. We'll have sections of DNA and they are called genes. And both forms of a gene are called alleles. So for things like eye colour, like I have blue eyes, I have two genes responsible for those blue eyes. One from my mum and one from my dad. 50%. Now my brother, he's got brown eyes, and he inherited a brown eye gene from my mum and maybe a blue eye gene from my dad. Who knows? But we can look at the potential. We can look at the probability of what you're going to inherit based on the alleles. So alleles are different forms of one gene. There is an awful lot of vocabulary in this topic. Just going to talk through some vocabulary. So we already said that alleles I'm wondering whether that's how you spell alleles now. I'll double check. Alleles are two forms of one gene, and you inherit one from mum and one from dad. Now, if you have two alleles the same, we would say that you were homozygous. Homo means the same. So for example, I've got blue eyes, so I've got little b. So I got the little blue-eyed gene from mum and little blue-eyed gene from dad, so that I am homozygous blue-eyed gene. If you have two different alleles, then we would call you heterozygous. So my husband, for example, I know is heterozygous brown eyes, so he's got a big B and a little b because they are different. And we call these letters genotypes. So they are the alleles present in an organism. And then we've got the word phenotype, and that is the characteristic. So for example, big B, little b, the phenotype is brown eyes. Okay, quite a lot of key words there. Alleles, homozygous, heterozygous, genotypes, phenotypes. I suggest you kind of learn those as much as possible, and I will keep referring to them as we go through it, and also haploid and diploid cell. Let's talk about the most simplistic inheritance, which is sex inheritance. So whether you are born male or female. So there are two different alleles that determine your sex when born. So if you have two X chromosomes, you will be female. If you have an X and a Y chromosome, you will be male, okay? The Y chromosome can only be inherited from the male. The X chromosome can be inherited from the male or the female. So for example, during mitosis, we split down into 4 different cells, essentially 4 daughter cells. And in a female, you could have an X cell or an X cell. When male sperm undergoes meiosis, it can produce X's or Y's. It can't do both because they have half the genetic information. So if we put this into a punnet square to show probability, if we put mum on the top, dad on the side, mum can only pass on the X chromosome, and dad can pass on an X or a Y, and it is 50%. So if that egg comes into contact with that sperm, you're getting a girl. If that egg comes into contact with that sperm, you're getting a girl. If this one comes into contact with this sperm, that's a boy. That's also a boy. So probability is 50% male, 50% female. Now, in the exam, always write the probabilities because you always get a mark for those. So let's talk about dominant and recessive characteristics and how you get those. Talk about one of the required diseases that you need to know about, cystic fibrosis. Now, this is a disease of the lungs and of the soft membrane. So, for example, in the small intestine, where you get fibres built up, which means that absorbing nutrients is hard, you have shortness of breath. It shortens your life by quite a large majority, but it is what we call a recessive condition, which means that you have to have both recessive alleles to express the characteristic. Now we say, I'm going to put in quote, normal. So if you are normal without cystic fibrosis, that is a dominant gene. So it's a dominant allele, which means that if you inherit one cystic fibrosis allele and one normal allele, then you will be normal. If you have 2 normal genes, you will be normal. So you have to have the 2 recessive genes to be CS or cystic fibrosis. Okay, so if something is dominant, only one allele has to be present to express that characteristic. So let's talk about how we might go about inheriting with a punnet square cystic fibrosis. So let's say mum is a carrier, and let's say dad is also a carrier. Sorry, I haven't shown that that's bigger. Let's beef that up. Okay, so mum is a carrier, dad is a carrier. Now this means that mum doesn't express any symptoms of cystic fibrosis. She hasn't got cystic fibrosis, she just carries the gene. But because she's got the dominant normal gene, she is normal. So if this egg interacted with this sperm, normal child. If this egg interacted with this cystic fibrosis sperm, normal child. If this sperm interacts with this egg, normal child. However, if this sperm reacts with this egg, we've got CS. Okay, which means that out of 100%, 25% or 1 in 4 chance of having cystic fibrosis if both parents are carriers. There we go. Let's do the other one. The other disease that you have to know about is polydactyly. If you are a polydactyl, it means that you have more than 5 fingers. So most people are pentadactyl, which means they have 5 digits on each hand. Ta-da! Some people, quite often, if you have polydactyly, you're born with them here. Polydactyly is a dominant trait. So if you only need one of the alleles to be expressed. So if you were heterozygous PP, you would have poly. If you were little p, you would be normal. So big P, also poly. So for example, if mum had polydactyly, so she had like 6 fingers on one hand, for example, whereas dad was normal, these children are the 50% chance of poly. You can't carry a dominant disease, you can only express it or not. So if mum was polydactyly but dad was homozygous normal, then there would be a huge proportionate chance that your child would, 50% chance that they would be polydactyly. And that's how we inherit. If you don't want to draw the punnet squares, you can draw them in a slightly different format. I'll just show you on here. So I'm going to do the same thing. So if we've got mum here, I find these more complicated. So if that egg interacts with that sperm, you'd have big P, little p. If that egg interacts with that sperm, you'd have big P, little p. If that egg interacts with that sperm, you'd have little p. And then if that sperm interacts with that egg, you would have little p. And so you can then see them lined up. I'm not sure what's better. Some people prefer these, but I still prefer, if I'm honest, these ones. But you must do this. So you normally get a mark for putting the alleles in the right place, and you normally get a mark for doing this as well. Thanks for watching. That was it for today. Do let me know if there's any specific topics you want me to do. I'm just going to keep going through specific big topics and see if I can merge them all together. I'm going to also try a video on command words, maybe a song. See you next time, science fans.